Buenas tardes a todos. Soy Tomás Lavé. Algunos me pueden conocer. Soy asesor de frutos secos en nogales, en almendros y en ciruela Dayan. Y les quería dar la bienvenida a este Extension Talk, donde hablaremos sobre el manejo nutricional en nogales, que es parte del programa de extensión e innovación que se está gestionando entre toda la industria y liderado por la Universidad de California acá en Chile. Que la clave de esto es tratar de acercar un poco el conocimiento y la experiencia desde California a nuestras realidades chilenas. Muchas veces tratamos de hacer cosas muy parecidas a lo que se hace en Estados Unidos, pero tenemos nuestras propias realidades y en ese sentido tenemos que ser capaces de tomar lo positivo del modelo de extensión en Estados Unidos, que es un modelo que ya tiene 150 años de vida y que ha demostrado ser totalmente exitoso, y tratar de llevarlo a las problemáticas chilenas y a buscar también las soluciones que nos correspondan a nuestro país. La verdad es que siempre hemos tenido una muy buena relación y un muy buen vínculo entre productores, los centros de investigación, los investigadores personalmente, los asesores. En este caso vamos a tener aquí la gran presentación de Katherine, que es una farm advisor, que es el concepto de asesores en Estados Unidos. Y que lo que busca al final es un sistema industrial que interrelacione y que sea lo más colaborativo posible, tratando de que efectivamente todas las mejoras continuas se vayan generando, se vayan adaptando y adoptando en cada una de las actividades y en los rubros donde estamos llamados a esto. Así que la verdad que creemos que va a ser un tremendo aporte. Estamos convencidos de que todas estas cosas son posibles de hacer acá en Chile. El proceso hasta el minuto de las cosas que se han hecho, la verdad que ha sido bastante exitoso, así que los invitamos también a que esto que estamos partiendo en el caso de los nogales, sepan que es el inicio de un programa, no es una actividad suelta, así que esperamos contar con ustedes también para el resto de las actividades que vayan saliendo o en este fin de año o ya durante el año 2021, bajo los distintos formatos que a lo mejor el coronavirus nos permita. Dejo con ustedes ahora a Carlos Zúñiga, el doctor Carlos Zúñiga, quien va a ser de moderador de esto, y así que los invito un poco a participar, hagamos de esto lo más natural posible y que sea lo más interactivo, y aprovechemos al máximo esta oportunidad que tenemos de tener a Katherine Jarvis entre nosotros. Adelante, Carlos.
Gracias, Tomás. Hola, soy Carlos Zúñiga, soy ingeniero agrónomo titulado en la Universidad de Chile. Tengo mi mención de manejo de suelos y aguas. Tengo un doctorado en la Universidad del Estado de Washington, en Estados Unidos, en Ingeniería en Sistemas Agrícolas y Biológicos. Y trabajo en el Instituto de Investigación Agropecuaria en línea desde hace unos 14 años. Y mi línea de investigación va por el lado de los sensores remotos y la agricultura de precisión. Hoy día nos estamos reuniendo aquí para hablar un poco acerca del tema de la nutrición en nogales. Chile es el tercer productor mundial de nueces en el mundo, con un 11%, detrás de China y Estados Unidos, que entre los dos llegan al 72% de la producción nacional. Con un mercado cada vez más competitivo y con márgenes de rentabilidad que se estrechan, eso nos pide unos incrementos mayores de productividad y calidad de nuestro huerto, lo que nos hace abordar los distintos problemas que pueden afectar este objetivo, entre ellos la gestión eficiente del uso la gestión eficiente del agua en un escenario cada vez más escaso, y las enfermedades, entre otros aspectos, las técnicas de cosecha y secado también. El manejo nutricional es clave en estos aspectos y tenemos varios desafíos en el tema. Por ejemplo, entender lo que sucede en cada zona y de acuerdo a los distintos tipos de suelo y condiciones en las cuales nosotros cultivamos nuestro nogal. Hoy día nos va a acompañar Katherine Jarvis, que es doctora en horticultura de la Universidad de California en Davis, y se desempeña como Farm Advisor en el condado de Yolo, en California. Sus áreas de expertise están relacionadas con el manejo de los sistemas de las plantas y las relaciones suelo-agua-planta y nutrientes. El manejo de la calidad de suelos sódicos y salinos, entre otras cosas. Antes de que Katherine nos empiece a hablar, les debo recordar de que esta actividad va a ser grabada. Va a estar disponible en la web de chile.ucdavis.edu y en el canal de YouTube de UC Davis Chile. Podrán interactuar con nosotros enviando las preguntas y comentarios en el botón que aparece abajo que dice Q&A o pregunta y respuesta, que también puede aparecer en español. La actividad contará con traducción simultánea que pueden seleccionar en el botón que dice interpretación. Así que los dejo con Katherine y al final nos vemos en la parte de las preguntas.
Ok, muchas gracias. Ok, si tengo la vocabularia de una nena de 12 años en español, tenemos un traductor, pero te digo con mi poco español, buenas tardes. All right, so let's get going. Oh, I am hearing you in Spanish, so let me just turn this interpretation off. Great. Okay, so welcome. Thanks, Chile, for having me here today. I am, as was introduced by Carlos, I'm a farm advisor in the University of California Cooperative Extension System. I cover 3 counties in the Central Valley, which grow a lot of walnuts, also almonds and prunes and pistachios. One of the big things that I research is nitrogen management. So that's what we're going to be talking about mostly today. Also talking a little bit about potassium management, and then maybe in the Q&A afterwards, we can hit on a few other nutrients. So thank you for having me here today, and we'll just get started. All right. Okay, what a wild time and a funny way to learn from thousands of miles away. But this is the brave new world with all these new technologies. So here we go. All right, so first I'm going to talk about nitrogen management. We'll go through why nitrogen is important, nitrogen, how it works in the soil, and how it's taken up by the plant. And then we'll turn all of that science into management. So I like to, we're going to be talking for almost an hour, but I'm going to try to stop along the way and do some sort of synthesizing points of a couple of key takeaways. So for walnut nitrogen management, I would say there's a couple of key takeaways. For nitrogen, you need a minimum. Oh golly, I'm just realizing this is all in pounds. So I apologize, but you guys can do a rough, calculation of pounds to kilograms afterwards. We can put that in the chat. It's mostly ideas and not a lot of numbers, so that shouldn't be too challenging. So 29 pounds of nitrogen per ton of in-shell nuts that you harvest. So that's the amount of tons that you remove from the field. And you need to divide that evenly over the course of the growing season to make sure that you're applying it when the tree is best at taking it up, when the tree needs it. The roots of the tree are, for the most part, in the top 2 to 3 feet of the soil. And so we want to be sure that we're applying those nutrients, that nitrogen in particular, where the roots are so that they can take up the nitrogen. And finally, all nitrogen, no matter what form you apply it in, can turn into nitrate and can leach out of the soil and into the groundwater, which is bad. For us in California, we're very concerned about this because we've been using nitrogen fertilizers for a long enough time that a lot of it has gotten into our groundwater and has some negative health implications. But it's also, if it leaches out of the root zone, then it's not available for your trees to take up. You're literally washing money down into someone else's drinking water. So nitrogen, why is it important to the plants? It's the most used mineral of all the plants. So the thing that, of all the nutrients, 80% of that goes to protein. So that's one of the reasons that walnuts need a lot of nitrogen along with the other nut crops, is essentially we're growing protein. You know, if you're growing a fruit crop on your tree, you're growing sugar. If you're growing a nut crop, you're growing protein. So that's a huge demand of protein for nitrogen. But there's also lots of other ways that proteins work in the plant. So nitrogen makes up amino acids, DNA, hormones, which are signaling around the tree, do this, do that at different times in different ways. It makes up chlorophyll, which is, you know, the little green bits in the leaves that are taking light and turning that into sugar, which is why when we don't have enough nitrogen, we get yellow leaves, because we can't make chlorophyll without nitrogen. And it makes up defense compounds. So that's important for stresses of, you know, guarding off bugs, making things that make bugs not want to eat our crop, guarding off against fungal and bacterial pathogens, that sort of thing. So that's sort of thinking in terms of deficiency. When we don't have enough nitrogen in the plant, we see limited growth, we see leaf chlorosis, yellowing of the leaves, but much more often we see too much nitrogen applied. And that has negative implications for the plant because we get excessive vegetative growth. Hopefully you can see my little cursor here. Excessive vegetative growth on this tree here. This is this is 1 year of growth after this tree was planted as a bare root tree. And you can see that it just shot straight up because it had too much nitrogen, too much water. And now there's no scaffolds farther down. It's very hard to get a good structure of a tree. You get a big wind blowing through there and that can top that tree right off as it's young and not stable yet. So very important for young trees that we manage that nitrogen, not putting on too much. It delays leaf drop, having too much nitrogen, and can lead the tree to essentially stay awake too late into fall and winter. So you see here, this other picture is this tree was just juiced up with too much nitrogen. It didn't want to go dormant. It didn't want to go to bed in the fall. And then we had a sudden unexpected frost. So temperatures went below freezing and we got this damage on the wood because the trees were not dormant yet because they were overloaded with nitrogen. We can also see increased disease susceptibility if your tree is so loaded up with nitrogen that it's kind of sprinting, working really hard to do one thing and not focus on a whole suite of, being able to resist diseases as well as growing. So that's why it's important to the plant. It's also important to people because certainly in California, I don't know that you guys are having this problem yet, but if you stay the course of putting on too much nitrogen, you will have this problem eventually. It leaches out into the groundwater, which especially in rural areas is where most of our water comes from. So that gets into your tap water. It has a big problem with if babies drink water that is high in nitrogen, essentially they can't get oxygen in their blood, but it also has some implications for heart disease problems and other health problems in adults. So that's why we are trying to manage our nitrogen, both for the health of our trees and the health of our communities. So with nitrogen, I mean, really as with all fertilizers, you're trying to hit this sweet spot. I think of the fairy tale of Goldilocks, you know, not too little, not too much, but just right in the middle. We want the right amount to the trees when they need it and where they can get it. So to help figure out the right amount, the when and the where, it helps to understand the different forms of nitrogen and how that nitrogen can be taken up by the plant. So we're going to do some sort of basic review of this college level fertilizer management class, all boiled down into a couple of slides. So nitrogen in the soil, there's a number of different forms nitrogen can take in the soil. It can be in the form of soil organic matter. It can be in the form of ammonium, and it can be in the form of nitrate. And I'll add that you might apply it as urea, a fertilizer form, which then quickly turns into ammonium. So we're just going to talk about these three things, knowing in the back of our mind that urea turns into ammonium. Okay, so soil organic matter is nitrogen that is tied up in organic molecules, and as such is not available to the plants. We can think of this as sort of our nutrient storage vault. There are little microbes that munch away at this soil organic matter and slowly make it available, but it's not available when it's in the form of soil organic matter. Ammonium is one form that the roots of the plant can take up. It is positively charged, which we like because that means it sticks in the soil, because the soil is negatively charged, you know, sort of thinking like magnets, positive and negative. So if it can stick in the soil, it doesn't move out of the root zone as quickly with irrigation water. Nitrate is the other form that roots can take up. And so we like that part. We want our trees to be able to take up this nitrogen. But nitrate is negatively charged, so it will not stick in the soil. So it can easily leach with irrigation water or with rainfall. All right, so soil organic matter essentially gets munched on by microbes and turns into ammonium. This is in California soils, and I think for the time that I've spent in Chile, fairly similar climate. So I would say these rules are pretty much the same. Soil organic matter can turn into ammonium in a matter of weeks to months. This is from a microscope picture of a real microbe. That's what it looks like. I make a lot of jokes when I give presentations, and it's hard over Zoom to know if anyone's laughing, and it's even harder to know if that joke translates into Spanish. So when, because this is a microbe-driven process, the microbes like moisture and they like warm conditions and they need oxygen. So this process happens faster when it's moist, when it's aerated, when it's warm. So this is something to keep in mind when you add organic amendments like compost, like manure, that it can either, these amendments sort of, they have a decision that they make, well, that the microbes make for them. The nitrogen in that organic matter might be locked up in soil organic matter, or it might become ammonium. And the decision largely hinges on how much carbon is in that source. So if there's less than 2% nitrogen, that source is probably going to be locked up in the storage vault as soil organic matter, which is okay. It'll just give like a slow drip of nitrogen over the growing season instead of a big wallop of a big dose of nitrogen all at once. Okay, so soil organic matter becomes ammonium, and then ammonium in our soils turns to nitrate. So we call this nitrification. And it's also a microbe-driven process. So that makes it also dependent on temperature. But it's a faster process. So this happens in a matter of days to weeks. In California soils, and I would say this is also true in Chilean Central Valley soils, if nitrogen is not taken up, most nitrogen will eventually turn to nitrate, which can then leach out of your root zone and into the groundwater. So when I say a matter of days to weeks, what do I mean by that? So on the bottom of this graph here, you have weeks after pure ammonium has been applied. The two lines represent, gosh, again, I'm in Fahrenheit, so maybe Carlos in the chat, you can do the quick translation into Celsius for people. So at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, in a matter of a month, 4 weeks, only 40% of that ammonium has turned into nitrate. But when we get much warmer temperatures in the 75-degree range, it only takes 2 weeks for 100% of that ammonium to turn into nitrate. And to put that a little more in context, in the Central Valley here in California, and I assume it would be very similar in Chile, this is where our soil temperatures range in the top of the soil during the growing season. So after 2 weeks, you'll have about 50% of the ammonium you apply will have turned into nitrate if it hasn't already been taken up by the soil. Okay, so that is how nitrogen works in the soil. Let's think about how it's taken up by the plant. Few important things to know here. Nitrogen uptake is regulated because the trees use energy to take it up and to transform it into a form that's not toxic to the plant. And it has to go through transporters, which can create a bottleneck. So ammonium must turn to amino acids in the roots, because if it stays in the roots as ammonium, it burns, it's toxic. Like anyone who smelled a baby diaper knows that ammonium can be kind of toxic. So that requires energy. That's why we see this little blast of yellow here. That process takes energy that the tree is using. Nitrate, the other form that we're talking about, must actively be transported into the roots. So that active transport requires energy. So both of these processes require energy, which makes them highly regulated, which means that the tree is not going to take up much beyond what it needs. The tree is not going to waste energy on taking up nitrogen just because you put it there. So you can't shove a bunch more nitrogen into the tree if it doesn't need it, if it doesn't want it. And that's why we end up having nitrogen just hanging out in the soil, not being taken up by the tree, and then leaching out of the root zone. I'm just going to skip that. Okay, so to sort of recap these nitrogen dynamic points, nitrogen comes in many forms in the soil. Can come as soil organic matter, ammonium, or nitrate. Soil organic matter is our sort of nitrogen storage bank. But we have ammonium and we have nitrate, which are the forms that can be taken up by the tree. Nitrate does not stick in the soil, which makes it vulnerable to leaching. And nitrogen uptake requires energy, has to go through these transporters. So the tree is not going to just eat and eat and eat and eat nitrogen just because you put nitrogen there. It has limitations. It's only going to take up, unlike me during COVID, it only eats as much as it needs. It doesn't eat more just because you put it in its root zone. Okay, so more nitrogen applied does not necessarily mean more nitrogen taken up. All right, so we've hit on why nitrogen is important. We've hit on nitrogen in the soil and the plants. Let's try to transform that into some management steps. So in fertilizer management, we often talk about the 4 R's, and nitrogen is no exception to that. And I'm realizing now this also might not hold up to translation. But so we have the right rate, we have the right time, we have the right place, and we have the right source. And it's sort of a cheat because we just put the word right in front of everything, and that makes it the 4 R's. But these things, okay, what do these mean? So right rate is talking about, knowing that the trees regulate their uptake. So only giving the trees as much as they need to not be wasteful. Right time is knowing, again, that the trees regulate this uptake. So only putting the nitrogen on when the trees want to take it up, when they're willing to take it up. Applying in the right place is thinking about where the roots are in the tree system, and applying the nitrogen so that it can stay in that zone. And using the right source. So there's lots of different forms of nitrogen. As we talked about, there ammonium, nitrate, urea. Different sources have different susceptibilities to leaching. So thinking about, and have different considerations with soil pH, lots of other reasons. So there's no one right source for every single walnut orchard, but you have to keep in mind the different vulnerabilities, the positives and negatives of these different sources. Okay, so let's dig into this. Applying at the right rate is about matching the supply that you're putting on with the demand of the tree. Remembering that nitrogen uptake costs energy, so trees are going to minimize their uptake once their nitrogen demand has been met. And also that when we think about what we're calling supply here, we're thinking about not just the synthetic fertilizer that we're applying from a bag, but organic nitrogen that we have in our soil already, that we might have from cover crops, manure, compost, and also the nitrogen that is in our water source. Okay, so to put a visual to this, we have, this is our supply side on the left here, cover crops, manure, compost. Then we have our irrigation water, which certainly for us here in California, I would guess at least in the Santiago area, areas that have a long history of cultivated agriculture, maybe not down south where I know there's a lot more expansion recently, but certainly around the capital, I would guess there's plenty of nitrogen in your irrigation water. So you just test that. There's an easy formula to know how much free nitrogen you're getting from your water to go towards what your supply is. And then our commercial fertilizer we're also applying. Okay, so those are the nutrients that we're putting in. And we're hoping that gets up into the tree to balance the demand from the harvested crop, from the hulls, leaves, and any prunings that are removed from the orchard, and also, especially for younger trees, to grow the tree as well. So there's a little bit of, organic matter that is mineralizing into nitrogen, but for the most part, if the nutrients you're applying are not taken up by the tree, some of them will off gas, as you see in this arrow here, but most of it will be lost below the root zone and not be useful for your trees anymore. So I did a big research project with a number of other smart people up here in the UC system, looking at 3 different sites of both Chandler and Tulare varieties over 3 years. And what we found is that the minimum amount of nitrogen that the trees need is 29 pounds for every ton of nuts that you remove. So that is, we're talking here about mature trees. So that doesn't account for growing the tree. That's just thinking in terms of maintaining a large tree, a little bit of maintenance, pruning, a little bit of growth. So that's our right rate. Now let's think about applying at the right time. So the idea here is we're matching the timing of application with the timing of tree demand and root uptake, remembering that we have this limited number of transporters for nitrate to get in through. So we can get a bottleneck, you know, we can't just shove more in there. So trees take up nutrients most efficiently when it's needed. So what we did in this big 3-year research project was we looked at the timing of uptake of nitrogen. And we found what you see here is May, June, July, August, and harvest. Now, I know you guys are on the opposite side of the calendar from us, so let me just put this in context that our Chandler leaf out is in early April. So what you're seeing here is May is 1 month after leaf out. So 1 month after leaf out, then 2 months after leaf out, 3 months after leaf out, 4 months after leaf out, and harvest. What we found, you know, you don't really need to get too nerdy into the exact number of this bar, this bar, this bar, this bar. What I just want you to take away from this graph is that, okay, so the tan color here is the amount that was accumulated in one particular month. And then the brown color is what was accumulated in the months before. So we're building nitrogen in our crop here, and what's added in one particular month is just this tan color. So you can see that the tan colored part of the bar is about the same size each month of the growing season. May, June, July, August, the tree is taking up and needing about the same amount of nitrogen to grow the crop. The exception here, and the reason that I don't have April, or the month after leaf out, on this chart, is that we know that trees in that first month only rely on stored nitrogen, nitrogen that's already in the tree, to do that initial growth. That's a period in which the roots are just starting to grow. They're not very active at nitrogen uptake. And so applying nitrogen in that first month after leaf out, the trees are not taking up nitrogen. And so that will just be vulnerable to rain and leaching. So that's why you don't see the first month here. But in the second month and then through the growing season, nitrogen accumulation, nitrogen uptake is fairly even over the growing season. Okay, so when we think about our right time, we're talking about an even split of our nitrogen application over the course of the growing season. Okay, now let's think about right place. We're delivering the nitrogen to where the active roots are growing, keeping in mind that nitrate moves with water and everything can turn to nitrate eventually. So essentially our nitrogen moves with water. We're trying to minimize the movement of that fertilizer below the root zone where it won't be taken up by the tree. I guess I took out a slide here, but what we've found through research that another lab has done up here by digging up trees is that the vast majority of the roots are in the top 3 feet of the soil. Now, this does vary a little bit with the way that you fertilize, the way that you irrigate. And because the roots will grow where there's water available for them to grow. But they also like to grow mostly where it's warm. So So yes, if you dig up a walnut tree, especially a big old one, you can find roots down 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 feet. So, okay, meters again. You know, you can find roots 3, 4 meters down, but the vast majority of those roots are in the top 1 meter of the soil. I know a lot of you guys, especially I've seen around the capital, or in the capital district, are on these huge berms. So I would say, you know, when I'm talking about where the roots are, I'm talking about from the soil line down. So that berm would oftentimes be where the vast majority of your roots are. Okay, using the right source. Now this is probably the most, there's not one recipe that's perfect for this for everyone. But it's just about keeping in mind everything we've talked about, especially the leaching potential of these different sources. So, you know, if you are on a drip system, let's say, and you can put in a little bit of fertilizer every time you run your irrigation, then you could think about using something like calcium nitrate, because it's very susceptible to leaching, but you're only putting in a tiny dose each time. So it's very likely that the tree will take up what you're putting down each time. Whereas on the other hand, if you are like in an older situation with an old infrastructure, old irrigation system, sprinkler, or even flood, and you're only going to, you can't fertilize, you can't put your fertilizer in with your irrigation water, you're just going to broadcast it. Well, you might want something like ammonium sulfate, which is all ammonium, and so it'll take some time for that to turn into nitrate if it's not taken up by the tree. All right, so you just have to think through how much nitrogen you want, the percent nitrogen here, and the leaching potential of the different sources, and how much you can spread out your nitrogen application. I heard from Leticia that also the soil acidification is an issue for some of you guys. Some folks are in pretty low pH acidic soil. So this would also be something for you to consider if it's going to modify the acidity of your soil conditions. Okay. So that is nitrogen management in walnuts. We're thinking about our right rate, a minimum of 29 pounds per ton, our right time, an even split over the course of the growing season after that first month, the right place in the first 1 meter or 3 feet of the root zone, and the right source, just bearing in mind that everything can become nitrate eventually. So if you were, so the way that you could really apply this for any one particular field, you know, you would look at your yield history, and in the coming year, you had, based on your yields in previous years and the bloom conditions, you're expecting a 3-ton crop. And if you're doing your job right, following these 4 R's, it's safe to assume that 70% of the nitrogen that you apply can get up into the tree. So then we take that and we think about our right rate. Okay, I've got 3 tons times 29 pounds divided by that 70% efficiency factor. So that gets us to 124 pounds for the whole season. And I'm not following the chat, but hopefully maybe Carlos can be translating some of these numbers into kilograms for you guys. But you get, you know, the math is the same. It's the same equation, just slightly different numbers for kilograms and whatever metric tons you guys are using. That's the needs for the whole season. So then we think, okay, we've got 4 months in which we're applying this nitrogen over the growing season. So we divide that up evenly over the course of the growing season. That's our right time. We're thinking about our right place. We want to keep our irrigation in the top meter or so of the soil because that's where our roots are. That's where the roots will be taking up nitrogen. So we're managing our irrigation to not put on too much at one time and leach that nitrogen out of the root zone. And then we're thinking about our right source, what works for our system. As I said, really depends on if you can be fertigating, spoon feeding, or if you can only put on applications 3 or 4 times during the year. And I want to also highlight this asterisk here, this little star that, okay, we talk about 31 pounds, we talk about the need for the whole season. That's not just our synthetic fertilizer, that's also what's coming from our water, what's coming from our compost. Okay, whew. So that's nitrogen. Let's take a sip of water here. And talk about potassium. This will be much quicker. So this is the second most abundant mineral in terms of what is used by the plant. It's important for the tree because it helps signal stomata to open and close. So it helps deal with, you know, the little mouths under the leaf. So that helps deal with water stress. It allows our cells to expand. So that helps us get, you know, big, happy, healthy nuts. When we don't have enough of it, we see a cupping or a curling of the leaf. When it's really bad, you can get bronzing or graying at these curled edges. And so certainly, you know, we haven't done a lot of research on this in walnuts, but we know that in prunes, for example, low potassium can lead to a weak canopy fill, which can lead to sunburn and all other sorts of disease problems that then follow on sunburn. You can also get sunburn on the fruit or the nut itself. So for the health of the tree long-term, to avoid sunburn at harvest, potassium is also important to keep a hold on. Okay, so potassium is a positively charged ion, which again, we remember the sort of the magnet of the soil, positive and negative. So positive sticks in the soil, sticks to those clay particles in the soil. It's really the clay particles that drive that. So if you're in a sandier soil, potassium doesn't stick around nearly as much. But this is one of the reasons that what we do with potassium more than anything is banding it. Instead of broadcasting, you band it just in a zone so that you can sort of overload that zone and make sure that there's some potassium that's still available after some is stuck to the soil. The other thing that often happens here is if you're in a drip irrigation system, putting it on in the drip, because then you're also concentrating it just where that dripper is. Or we can put it on as a foliar spray and avoid this whole sticking in the soil mess in general. What we usually do is some combination of those two things because foliar potassium is very expensive. So, so you would do some through your drip line or in a band, and then a little bit on top of that in your trees. So, okay, so how much does potassium does walnuts use? How do we recognize deficiency? How do we replace it when it has been used? So the vast majority of potassium that's used in walnuts goes into the hull. This is from our same trial measuring at harvest the accumulation of potassium, but then when we broke it down, this light green bar is what's in the hull and the brown bar is what's in the nuts and shell. So the vast majority is in the hull. By the time you get to harvest, we're talking more than 40 pounds in every ton of nuts, but it's only about 10 pounds in the meat and the shell. So if you're what we might call a green year, so if you are harvesting and a lot of the hulls also come off the field, then you're gonna need to replace a lot more potassium than in a year where you're only taking meat and shells and all of the hulls are staying in the orchard. So this is what potassium deficiency looks like. The less extreme the deficiency, the less severe the symptoms. So we have this cupping, this sort of bronzy silver look, but it's also important to know that this does not appear until we reach 1.2% potassium in the leaves. And we know that yield already suffers below 1.5% potassium. So that's all to say that you should not wait until you see these ugly leaves, start thinking about your potassium levels, and start applying potassium. So this is some work that was done by another farm advisor a couple of decades ago, actually, looking at what we have here on the bottom is yield. As yield increases, that yield increases as the percent of potassium in the leaf increases. So we see what we're really looking for. Let's see the next one. Oops, excuse me. Is this, we want our leaf potassium levels, if you take them to a lab to test, to be above 1.5%. That's where we know you'll still be getting good yields, at least that potassium won't be limiting your yields. It's 1.2% down here at the bottom of this red band is where you start seeing ugly leaves from not enough potassium. So there's this whole zone in here in which you might not see ugly leaf symptoms, but you'll still have a decline in yield, which really makes the case for leaf sampling and lab analysis of your leaves during the summer. Okay, so as I said, one of the many ways, I think the prime way that we apply potassium is banding it, or you can shank it in, so burying it in the soil a little bit if you're using a flood irrigation system. But it's important that you apply it to the soil in the same area every year. We're banding it at least 4 to 5 feet out from the tree row, and applying that in the fall or the winter, because again, potassium being positive, it doesn't move nearly as much with the rainwater, so that we actually like putting it on just before winter rains, so those winter rains will move it in. Potassium sulfate is the safest form to apply to the soil. You can also apply potassium chloride if you know that you'll get enough chloride to drain, enough rainwater to move that chloride out of the root zone. We don't want a bunch of chloride building up in your soils because that's toxic to the plant. So if you were to apply 40 pounds of potassium sulfate, that can replace the 10 pounds you would use on an annual basis. So that's sort of a maintenance amount to apply. Recovering from deficiency would require much more. I know we're getting towards the end of the hour. I don't have much more here, so hang with me. So managing potassium takeaways, depending on if you're taking off a lot of hulls in your harvest, it's really easy to get at least mild potassium deficiencies, which can cause problems with heat stress, with weak canopies, and with sunburn. We're looking for 1.5% or higher in our leaf levels. And depending on how much hulls you pull off with your crop every year, you might need to replace anywhere from 10 to 50 pounds of potassium with every ton of nuts that you harvest. Okay, so that 10 pounds can be replaced with about 40 pounds of potassium sulfate. Okay, so to sort of pull this all together, when we think about, and I didn't talk about this much, but midsummer leaf levels for nitrogen, we're looking for at least 1.3%. For potassium, we're looking for 1.5% at least. Nitrogen, for every ton of nuts that you harvest, you need to replace or backfill or anticipate using 28 pounds of nuts, 28 pounds of nitrogen, and anywhere from 10 to 50 pounds of potassium. Nitrogen, we want to be applying steadily over the course of the growing season, with the exception of the first month. And potassium, we can just apply in the fall or winter if we're using this soil applied approach. Nitrogen, we want to be applying where the roots grow most, keeping our water in the top 2 to 3 feet of the soil. The top meter. Potassium, we're banding a little ways away from about 1.5 meters out from the trunk, and in the same location every year. All right. That is the same stuff I just said. So that's what I had to talk with you guys about today. I should say all of this research was funded by our Department of Food and Agriculture and the California Walnut Board up here, and a bunch of other very smart people helped with the research that went into this talk. Okay.
Thank you, Katherine. This was a really amazing presentation. Thank you very much. So let's have some questions. We have tons of questions here.
Great.
It's okay, Leticia? It's okay? We can go with the questions?
It's okay.
Okay. So the first question is coming from Ricardo, and it's asking, what do you think about biostabilized replacing the traditional fertilizers, and what do you should care about? I mean, what are the considerations that you need to have when you have some foliar analysis?
So I think we call these biostimulants up here in English.
Biostabilized.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is growing of interest up here in California as well. I'm hoping this is the same thing as a biostimulant, because we don't have the word biostabilizer in English, or that's not something I'm familiar with. But it's sort of sources of fertilizer that have like a microbial activity to it, that sort of thing. And I guess I would say, I think about like those reality shows where they drop somebody in the middle of the desert and they're like, hey, just survive, and we see how they do. So that's often the same thing that ends up happening with these biostimulants, or these microbe-driven.
I think we're not talking about the same, but
we're not talking about the same thing. Yeah, okay, what's a biostabilizer then?
Yeah, I have the same question. So let's see if Tomas can say something. Tomas, you are familiar with biostabilized? Sí, está familiar.
Sí, Carlos, un poco yo creo que la pregunta tiene un poco más de relación con compost, con materia orgánica estabilizada ya.
Yeah.
It's not the same. It's not the same as compost.
Pero está relacionado un poco con eso, la pregunta.
Okay. So, let me see. Yes.
Well, can maybe Carlos put a few more details about his question in the chat? I'm sorry, not Carlos, Ricardo. We can come back to it.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. We can come back to that question again. So, what's your opinion about the inhibitors of nitrification? No.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think theoretically it makes sense. But it's just like, for the most part, what I've seen on the market is pretty expensive and not worth the expense. I think, especially if you have a fertigation system set up so that you can be, applying your nitrogen and your water at the same time, that strikes me as, at the moment, a much more cost efficient way to make sure that the nitrogen that you're applying gets up into your tree. I have seen that this works pretty well for young trees, using something with an inhibitor or a slow release fertilizer, because it's much easier to, that's a smaller root zone, so you're applying a smaller amount of fertilizer, so the demand is lower also, and then you can just put a little around the tree and it'll slowly release on its own. But for the scale, the amount of fertilizer we're talking about applying, I think it just doesn't pencil out economically to be using a nitrogen inhibitor. But the science is fine, it's just a money issue.
Which strategy do you recommend to make an orchard more homogeneous when the conditions in the soil are different? For example, that is really common here, that you have some places with a lot of clay and other ones with sand, other ones with rocks, everything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's difficult. I mean, I think that's why that ground ends up being less expensive. It's so I guess one way of managing that is sort of defaulting to a slow, what do we call it? Like a spoon feeding approach, we would say in English. So just giving a little bit of everything at a time. So you end up sort of managing to the most difficult soil. So assuming that the most difficult soil will not hold much water, will have the nitrate leach through it very quickly, I would then favor a drip irrigation system with a fertilizer built into it, so that you can be giving just a little bit of water, 2 to 3 times a week, and so that you can be giving a little bit of fertilizer at a time. So that's the answer if you haven't even started your orchard yet. I mean, from there, really, if you've already got your orchard in the ground, you already have your infrastructure set up. Whatever you can do to set up a fertigation system. I've seen a lot of people like come up with very inventive and not very costly ways to do that. But definitely remembering that, yeah, if you're in a sandy or a stony area where nitrogen doesn't stay in the soil very easily, you're going to need to be applying smaller doses there in whatever fashion you can.
Okay. Tomás, ¿quieres hablar de la primera pregunta?
Sí, no, lo hace que un poco lo de la primera pregunta tiene justamente, es más bien un nombre de fantasía el tema del bioestabilizado, porque se refiere efectivamente a la materia orgánica, pero no en su estado más fresco, sino que en un estado más avanzado de compostaje.
Okay, we would say like cured compost. Okay, I got it.
Yep.
Thank you. All right, so.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's interesting. Like cured compost is sort of the actual traditional fertilizer, and it's only the last 60 years that we've had these synthetic fertilizers. You know, there's very few growers up here who rely exclusively on this biostabilized fertilizer. It's more like a complement. It's just really hard to match the timing of release of these fertilizers and make sure it's so much compost to meet the demand of that crop. So you've really got to just do your math, thinking about really in the year that you apply that compost, maybe 30% of it will be available that year. And then it'll slowly make more of that nitrogen available over the coming years after that. So you just have to keep that in mind, and you have to be applying that fertilizer every year so that you get that 30% in one year, but then you'll be getting, you know, 15% from the year before that and 7% from the year before that. And that kind of adds up to meet your demand. Yeah, so I think the biggest caution with using that would be to just keep an eye on the nitrogen levels in your leaves midsummer. You want to be looking for that 2.3% at least. Also thinking about other forms of nitrogen that you can get, because that's just a lot of money to spend on compost. So, but if you're in an organic system, that's what you got to do. You know, looking at cover crops, nitrogen-based cover crops like clovers, lucerne, that sort of thing, to also get some other cheaper nitrogen sources. Okay, thanks, Tomas.
So the other question is written in English. So
Yeah,
if you have a good soil with enough nitrogen for the trees, it's not that necessary to add more nitrogen that is not organic, and for the plantation process to be more eco-friendly?
So yeah, thank you for this question, Carlos. I didn't touch on this as much, but certainly when the trees are young, when you've just planted an orchard, it is worth taking a soil test, doing a soil test to find out how much nitrogen is in your soil, because oftentimes for the first, certainly 2 years, maybe even up to 4 years, you can meet the needs of your trees with the nitrogen that's in the soil. Because it's really when you start taking nuts off of the orchard, the nuts are where a lot of that nitrogen goes, the most of that nitrogen goes. So yes, you can probably get by with the nitrogen that's in the soil for the first couple of years, but that's not going to do it after that. So you need to start thinking about adding some form of nitrogen after that. And as we just talked about with Ricardo's question, certainly there are some more traditional, less synthetic ways of getting that. So we can be thinking about cover crops. Cover crops that fix nitrogen, like clovers and vetches and that sort of thing. We can be thinking about, there are organic synthetic fertilizers. We would, if you have a lot of nitrogen in your soil, you might have a lot of nitrogen in your groundwater as well. So look at how much water is coming, how much nitrogen is coming from your water. Up here, there are more and more people experimenting with like having sheep in your orchard, for example, so that you're bringing in some fertilizer, but organic regulations say that those sheep need to be out, I think 120 days before harvest, so that there's not microbes from the sheep poop that is, you know, getting on the walnuts. So yeah, so there's other non-synthetic ways to get that fertilizer, but if you're going to go that non-synthetic route, you need to take a little from a lot of different columns, because it's a lot of nitrogen is needed in these nut crops. It's not nearly as easy to meet the nitrogen demands of nuts as it is like fruit crops organically.
Okay. So considering the same yield for, this is a question from Jessica, and considering the same yield, are there any differences among different varieties in the nutrient demands?
Yeah. So we looked at Chandler and Tulare and found no significant difference in the nitrogen needs of the crop. The vast majority of that nitrogen is going into the meat. And so unless you have some dinky little variety that has way less percent meat in it than Chandler and Tulare, then you should have the same nitrogen needs approximately. And if you have way less meat in your nut, then you don't want to be growing that anyway. So I would say for all the commercial varieties, it's about the same.
Okay. Yeah. So from Pedro, should the right time of application considers also when the roots are more actively growing? When have you seen the highest root growth?
Yeah, great question, Pedro. So we are, this has been an area of active research recently, because traditionally we have thought about a big root flush in the spring and then a big root flush in the fall. Root flush, so like a lot of root growth in the spring, a lot of root growth in the fall. But I think that perception came from much older ways of growing crops, where we weren't irrigating them as much during the growing season. So now that we are supplying an environment that the tree likes to grow roots in, we're finding that the roots are growing throughout the growing season. So from, for us, from April until September, October. And this makes sense actually, because the roots that take up nutrients actually only live for about 14 days. So the roots that take up nutrients and also that take up water, the tree is constantly having to replenish that supply of nutrients to grow new nutrients. Excuse me. The tree is constantly having to grow new roots so that it can take up those nutrients. So that question of, are you applying in the same time that the roots are growing, that has been considered in these recommendations.
Okay, so on the same page, is it necessary to consider the reserves content at the beginning of the season in the strategy of nitrogen application?
So I would say, yeah, so the reserves are in that first, are utilized in that first month after leaf out. So I wouldn't go and apply nitrogen fertilizer in the first month after leaf out. I would be applying it after that.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
So this question is coming.
Katherine, a propósito de eso mismo, para profundizar.
Yeah.
Carlos, un poco déjame para ver el tema de la reserva. A propósito justamente de la reserva de ese primer mes, si es que ella tiene alguna experiencia en el análisis de reserva y si es que hay algunos ciertos parámetros que se podrían ya considerar para estar tranquilos en el inicio de la temporada, para ese primer mes donde no se fertiliza.
Like, do I have a way to know if you're at a full enough capacity?
Sí, por ejemplo, análisis de arginina u otro tipo de análisis que permita saberlo.
No, to be honest, we have not looked at that. I would say that So we rely a lot on mid-season nitrogen levels in the tree from the leaf analysis mid-season. And if you see that that is in the 2.3 range or above, I would have no doubt that you'll have enough nitrogen for that first month the following growing season. There's a lot of storage reserves in those big trees. It's not something that we say turns on a dime. You know, it doesn't, that nitrogen status doesn't change very quickly. There was before my time, there was an experiment done up here where they withheld all nitrogen from an orchard system to see how quickly the trees would go into a deficient status. And, you know, these trees had a lot of nitrogen going into the experiment, and there was probably some nitrogen in the soils, but not a lot. And it took 4 years before they started seeing levels down at so low that it would decrease the yields. So there's a lot of nitrogen stored in those trees, and I wouldn't worry much about being totally sure that you have enough to get through the first month. Does that answer your question, Tomás? Yeah, okay.
Sí, lo único que acá en Chile algo se está tratando de investigar, de ver si es que algunas estructuras de reserva en las raíces, en ramas, ver si es que a lo mejor la acumulación de arginina tomado en otro momento nos da mayor tranquilidad con respecto a ese estado de reserva para la temporada inicial. Pero está correcto lo que ella contestó.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think there's certainly ways that you can measure it to be sure, but I think it would be uncommon that it would be a big problem. So I'm not sure that that's worth a huge investment. But at the same time, like, an orchard is a big investment. So if running a $50 test makes you sleep better at night, like, that's, you know, that's fine too. Yeah.
Okay. So from Juan, he's asking Katherine, if you have drip irrigation.
Oh, did we need Jessica's question?
Sorry?
This micro sprinkler versus drip question? I'm sorry.
I didn't get. Okay. So if you have a drip irrigation and your fertilization is going through the drippers, which will be the best moment to apply potassium chloride if it's not possible to make it during winter?
Okay, yeah, this is a tough question because my concern would be with the chloride. So really the question is, when will chloride do the least damage to my tree? So I would say later in the season, towards the second half or the last third of the season, because at that point, yeah, because what I would be most concerned about with putting on potassium chloride in a drip system is that chloride will build up in the leaves and damage the leaves, and then you'll have leaves dying and that sort of thing. The leaves have mostly come out and are full size by the middle of the season, and they're going to start looking kind of ugly anyway by the end of the season. So if this is the only form of potassium you have to apply, I would put it on in the second half or the last third of the growing season. But I would actually much sooner say, don't use potassium chloride in your drip system. If you're going to use potassium chloride, just put it on in the fall or, you know, going into winter, and find some other kind of form of potassium to put into your drip system, like KTS or something like that.
So the next question is coming from Sebastian. And no, sorry, from Juan. It's what kind of diseases can you bring into the orchard if you bring hulls from other farms as potassium fertilization strategy?
Yeah. So I think I don't know if you guys. Okay, so I can answer that from a California context, but I don't actually know all of the diseases that you guys have down there. So any disease that would be in the hull, that would rot the hull. So I'm thinking for us, it's Botrosphaeria diseases would be one of my main concerns.
Yeah.
Is probably would be my main concern. And the other, I mean, depending on the quality, we have a fly called walnut husk fly here that chews away at the hull. So you might bring some walnut husk fly larvae in. But like that said, I wouldn't worry that much. I mean, especially if it's coming from another orchard that's pretty good about their sanitation, doesn't have a lot of disease in it, I wouldn't worry too much about bringing in other diseases.
Okay. So let's continue because there are many questions and not too much time. So Sebastian is asking, if you have full coverage sprinkler system, would you still recommend banding the potassium or one time on fall or to apply it evenly in the season?
So potassium, I would still recommend banding it because it really only, the thing you're really trying to do is concentrate it in a small patch. So you can do that with drip system, or you can do that with a narrow band. But if you're putting it on through your sprinkler system, you're spreading that potassium over a really wide area, and it's never going to build up to a high enough concentration that it'll overload the sticky parts of the soil, and then there'll still be some floating around. So if you have a sprinkler system, I would still recommend banding and then maybe a little foliar application to top that off.
Okay, so you answered the next question, I think. Or would you choose to applying it on every irrigation, at every event of irrigation? Right?
Yeah.
Juan is asking, could you refer us to the study? Oh, okay. It's asking for the reference of the study concluding the 29 pounds of nitrogen per ton.
Yeah, we haven't written it in a journal yet. It's just been in reports to the California Walnut Board.
Okay, and I would like to say that 1 pound, it's 453 grams, or almost half of a kilogram.
Yeah, so it should be what, 14 kilos of nitrogen?
Yeah, something like that.
14, 14.
So the last question is asking Sebastian, what kind of foliar potassium would you recommend?
Well, I don't have a good answer for that. I can't really actually rattle anything off the top of my head. KTS. Here we have a lot that are like mixed in with micronutrients, other micronutrients. So, but yeah, you can only, it's a tricky way to try to get potassium into the tree. You can get maybe 5 to 8 pounds in for every application. So it's still not usually the most cost-effective way to get your potassium on. We kind of use it as a way to like top off the tank, we say.
Okay. Tomás, ¿quieres un poco, a lo mejor responder también esa pregunta?
¿Cómo, Carlos?
Ahora sí, si quieres un poco responder a lo mejor esa pregunta. Dice, ¿qué tipo de potasio foliar
No,
recomendaría?
la pregunta está bien.
Okay.
Sí, no, lo que respondió Katherine está correcto con la pregunta.
Okay. Well, I don't know if we have some. I think we don't. Yeah. Yes. So.
Ready.
I have more questions here, so I'm seeing if there's someone that is not answered yet. No, that's okay. So let's. I would like to thank Katherine for the presentation and answering our questions today. I would like to also to thank to all the audience today and UC Davis for inviting me and making this possible. Thank you. Leticia or Natalia?
Sí, bueno, en nombre de UC Davis Chile, agradecer a todos, en especial a Katherine por su presentación, por entregarnos su conocimiento, toda su experiencia, a Carlos, a Tomás por haber facilitado este diálogo, que obviamente daría como para hacer mucho más preguntas. Para nosotros esta actividad tiene un significado muy importante porque, como decía Tomás al inicio, nosotros vamos a comenzar a trabajar en un programa de extensión e innovación en nogales, en el cual queremos abordar los problemas reales que tiene la industria y de una forma vinculada, en el cual participan todos los actores que están vinculados a la producción de nogales y a su vez vinculando las capacidades que tiene Chile y que también están en California. Así que, bueno, creo que, como dijo Carlos, hemos contestado casi todas las preguntas, pero por favor no duden en escribirnos si tienen quieren seguir profundizando sobre estos temas o también interiorizándose un poco más sobre nuestro programa de extensión e innovación. Les dejo mis datos de contacto, Natalia Díaz, cnadíaz@ucdavis.edu, para que puedan contactarse y, bueno, y podamos seguir generando con este vínculo y ojalá se abra la puerta para seguir realizando también más actividades que contribuyan a la competitividad de esta industria. Así que gracias a todos y, bueno, buenas tardes y que termine muy bien su día. Chao.
Bueno, gracias por la invitación. Suerte.
Bye.
Muchas gracias.